Welcome to the Global Board Institute's Super Forecaster Geopolitical Crisis Briefing for the week of April 2nd, 2026. I'm presenting this week's board-level analytical briefing on the Israeli-US-Iranian war and its global implications. This is issue number 3 in our weekly series. This is day 33 of active conflict following the coordinated US-Israeli strikes on Iran launched on February 28th. The most significant developments this week center on the emerging ceasefire for Hormuz framework. President Trump claimed on April 1st that Iran's president requested a ceasefire, though Tehran immediately denied this as false and baseless. Trump has extended the pause on strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure until April 6th, creating a critical deadline that will shape the coming week. Meanwhile, the military situation continues to intensify on multiple fronts as Israel deepens its infiltration of Lebanon and its intent to occupy all of southern Lebanon. Iraqi militia attacks have now exceeded 291 since the war began, and the Strait of Hormuz has moved from selective blockade to near-total shutdown, with effectively zero commercial transits. The diplomatic track is simultaneously the most promising and most fragile element of this conflict. The gap between Trump's 15 demands and Iran's 5 conditions remains enormous, but the fact that messages are being exchanged through Pakistan, Oman, Turkey, and Egypt represents a structural change. This briefing is classified board confidential and intended exclusively for the members of the Global Chairs and Board Directors Network. Let's begin. Before we proceed, a brief but important disclaimer. This briefing is for informational purposes only. All documented facts presented today are sourced and cited from credible outlets. Where we move into analytical inference or probabilistic forecasting, that is clearly labeled throughout. Our super forecasting probabilities represent best estimates as of this morning, April 2nd, 2026, and are subject to rapid change given the volatility of the situation. You will notice several probability shifts from last week's briefing, which we will call out explicitly as we go through each slide. This briefing does not constitute legal, financial, political, military, or investment advice. We encourage all board members to consult their own professional advisors when making governance decisions based on the intelligence presented here. This is not opinion. This is structured analysis built on verifiable data. We employ a super forecasting framework that combines 4 core disciplines: base rate analysis, trajectory extrapolation, scenario modeling, and Bayesian probability updating, all powered by AI. Every probability you see in this briefing is the result of that structured analytical process, and every number is updated weekly as conditions evolve. Our primary sources include the world's leading think tanks and research institutions, and for real-time developments, we draw from a broad spectrum of international news sources including Al Jazeera, Reuters, Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN, Axios, and regional outlets. This week, we have added several important new analytical inputs. The Dallas Federal Reserve has published economic modeling on the Hormuz closure impact. The Atlantic Council has released a comprehensive GCC analysis examining how the Gulf will emerge from this war. UNCTAD has issued a shipping disruption report quantifying the global trade impact. The Intercept has published an investigation into US casualty reporting, and the Arms Control Association has released their April analysis on the diplomatic track. Let's begin with the executive summary. 5 critical headlines that every board member needs to understand this morning. First, active war, day 33. US and Israeli forces have now struck over 9,500 targets inside Iran, up from 8,000 last week. Mujtaba Khamenei continues consolidating power with IRGC backing. The most significant diplomatic development is Trump's claim that Iran's president requested a ceasefire, which Tehran immediately denied as false and baseless. Trump has extended the pause on energy infrastructure strikes until April 6th, creating a critical near-term deadline. Second, the multi-front war continues across 5 active theaters. Israel has escalated significantly in Lebanon by destroying the Qasmiya Bridge, the main crossing over the Litani River. This signals clear intent to occupy all territory south of the Litani. Lebanese casualties have risen from 1,070 to over 1,200, with 1.2 million displaced. Iraqi militias have now claimed 291 attacks since the war began, with fiber optic drones and direct strikes on Camp Victory. Third, the energy crisis has deepened in one critical respect. While oil prices remain volatile around $99 to $102, the Hormuz situation has worsened from a selective blockade to a near-total shutdown. Container shipping costs have increased to 175% above baseline. The ceasefire for Hormuz framework is now the key variable. Fourth, nuclear risk remains acute. The IAEA still cannot access Natanz. Iran's stockpile of 440.9 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium remains unaccounted for. Fifth, board action now centers on the dual-track reality. A ceasefire for Hormuz deal is the first genuine off-ramp, but Iran's public denials mean boards must prepare for both outcomes. Let me now give you the operational picture across all 5 active fronts, updated from last week. The headline numbers show continued escalation. Over 9,500 US-Israeli strikes have hit targets inside Iran, up from 8,000 last week. Iran has fired more than 4,000 projectiles, up from 3,500. The total estimated deaths across all fronts now exceeds 6,800. And Hormuz transits have dropped to effectively zero, a dramatic worsening from the 16 ships we reported last week. On the Iran front, the big development is the diplomatic contradiction. Trump says Iran asked for a ceasefire. Iran says this is false and baseless. What we know is that messages are being exchanged through mediators, and the energy infrastructure pause has been extended to April 6th. Meanwhile, strikes continue on industrial and civilian infrastructure. On April 1st, former Foreign Minister Kamal Karazi was seriously injured and his wife killed in an airstrike. A desalination plant on Keshem Island in the Strait was also destroyed. In Lebanon, the situation has escalated dramatically. Israel destroyed the Kazmia Bridge, the main crossing over the Litani River, a clear signal of intent to control all territory south of the river. Deaths have risen from 1,070 to over 1,200, with 1.2 million displaced. That is 20% of Lebanon's entire population. Across the GCC, total projectiles fired now exceed 3,000, with the UAE absorbing more than half. Over 50 people have been killed or injured across all 6 states. In Iraq, the Islamic resistance in Iraq has claimed 291 attacks since February 28th. Camp Victory was set ablaze on March the 21st and struck by a fiber optic drone on March 25th. In Gaza, the Phase 2 ceasefire remains fragile with aid at just 24% of agreed levels. Now let's move to what boards really need, forward-looking scenario analysis. And this is where we have significant probability shifts from last week. Our base case has been revised upward again, from 50 to 55%. Last week, we assessed this at 50%. This week, based on the emerging ceasefire for Hormuz framework, Trump's extended energy pause, and active multi-channel mediation, we've revised that to 55%. The April 6th deadline creates a forcing function that didn't exist before. Our escalation scenario has been revised downward from 25 to 20%. Last week, we assessed this at 25%. This week, based on the diplomatic momentum and Iran's apparent willingness to exchange messages through mediators, we've revised that to 20%. However, the IRGC's autonomous cell structure and the April 6th deadline both pose escalation risks if diplomacy fails. Regime change remains at 15%, unchanged from last week. New data showing 4,700 security forces killed suggests greater internal stress than previously understood, but Mojtaba Khamenei's IRGC consolidation appears to be holding, and the wildcard scenario remains at 10%. The Houthi pause continues to hold, and the absence of full Red Sea resumption keeps this at the same level. However, Bloomberg's warning that Houthi re-engagement could push oil to $140 underscores the severity of this tail risk. The net shift this week is again toward the diplomatic track. 5 percentage points moved from escalation to base case, but I want to emphasize the April 6th deadline. If Trump does not extend the energy pause and resumes strikes on oil facilities, these probabilities could reverse dramatically within 24 hours. This slide addresses the 2 time horizons that matter for governance: the ceasefire horizon and the lasting peace horizon. On the ceasefire probability window, the current window through April has increased from 10 to 15%. The ceasefire for Hormuz framework and Trump's April 6th deadline create a specific near-term inflection point that didn't exist before. If Iran agrees to reopen the strait in exchange for a ceasefire, this probability could jump dramatically. May through July remains at 40% as we expect diplomatic engagement to formalize if the April framework doesn't produce an immediate result. August through December decreases from 40 to 35% because probability mass has shifted earlier into the April and May-July windows given the active diplomatic track. Beyond 2027 remains at 10%, as the scenario where this drags on for over a year becomes less likely with active diplomacy. On the right side, lasting sustainable peace. We have added Hormuz freedom of navigation guarantees to the prerequisites, reflecting the centrality of the strait to any durable resolution. The gap between Trump's 15 demands and Iran's 5 conditions defines the negotiation space, and it remains enormous. Our assessment is unchanged, a 5 to 15-year horizon for a sustainable regional peace framework. A ceasefire is achievable in months. Peace requires a generation. Now, let's turn to what this means for business, starting with energy and supply chains, where the Hormuz situation has reached its most critical point. The headline numbers show a mixed and volatile picture. Brent crude is trading between $99 and $102, with significant daily swings driven by diplomatic signals. But the Hormuz situation has dramatically worsened. Last week, we reported 16 transits. This week, the strait is under an effective blockade with near zero commercial transits. The Dallas Federal Reserve projects WTI averaging $98 in the second quarter. Container shipping costs have worsened further, now up 175% from baseline, compared to 150% last week. The Shanghai Containerized Freight Index remains at COVID-era highs. On the choke point analysis, Hormuz is now the single most critical variable. Trump has explicitly conditioned a ceasefire on Hormuz reopening. Iran has explicitly refused, claiming sovereignty over the strait. This standoff will define the next week. The Bab el-Mandeb situation has become more precarious. Bloomberg Economics warns that Houthi re-engagement could push oil to $140. A senior Houthi official signaled potential naval blockade of ships belonging to aggressor nations. The Suez Canal continues to operate at reduced capacity with declining Egyptian revenues. CMA-CGM's $3,000 per container surcharge remains in effect, and the structural shift warning from last week is reinforced. The Dallas Fed, Goldman Sachs, and UNCTAD all project that this disruption is structural, not temporary. Boards should plan for permanently elevated logistics costs. Let me walk you through the business impact region by region with this week's updated data. In the United States, the defense sector picture has shifted notably. The ITA ETF is up 47% year over year, but has pulled back recently as analysts downgrade from buy to hold, citing stretched valuations at 34 times earnings. RTX remains up 68% year over year. The war is costing the US approximately $1 billion per day. Significantly, 15 US soldiers have been killed and over 520 wounded, numbers that The Intercept reports may be understated. Trump's oscillation between military threats and peace overtures creates additional uncertainty. In the GCC, Saudi Arabia's NEOM contracts have now been cancelled, not just suspended. FDI remains down 60 to 70%. An estimated 5,000 American workers have departed or are preparing to leave. However, the Atlantic Council notes that GCC solidarity has actually strengthened, with Saudi-UAE cooperation improving despite pre-war tensions. In Europe, gas prices remain doubled. The most significant development is growing European momentum for UN-mediated talks, with multiple heads of state calling for intervention. In the Asia-Pacific region, the container shipping cost increase to 175% is the most material change. China's 50% crude dependency on the Gulf remains the critical strategic vulnerability. Japan and Korea have activated energy security emergency measures. In North Africa, the pattern continues with declining Suez revenues and food price inflation across the region. Let's drill deeper into the GCC, because for many of our members, this is where the governance decisions are most acute. Saudi Arabia remains rated critical. NEOM construction contracts have moved from suspended to cancelled this week, a significant escalation in economic impact. The 5,000 American worker departures represent a brain drain that compounds the FDI decline. The kingdom's $840 billion investment portfolio faces its most severe stress since Vision 2030 launched. The UAE, rated high risk, has absorbed over 2,187 projectiles, more than half of all Iranian fire directed at GCC states. Despite this extraordinary volume, air defenses have been largely effective against missiles, though drones have been harder to intercept. At least 58 people have been injured. The diversified economy continues to show relative resilience. Qatar remains high risk following the Ras Laffan gas facility strike. Its mediator role becomes increasingly complicated when its own critical LNG infrastructure is under attack. 16 people were injured. Kuwait, rated high, has seen 32 people injured. US military bases in Kuwait remain priority targets, and limited economic diversification leaves it highly exposed. Bahrain is rated critical. The US Fifth Fleet headquarters is under direct targeting, and 4 people have been injured. Its small, concentrated economy and financial services sector face existential exposure. Oman maintains a nuanced medium assessment. While least targeted, its role as the key mediator relaying messages between Washington and Tehran through Pakistan makes it strategically invaluable. 5 people have been injured. The Atlantic Council's analysis suggests the Gulf that emerges from this war will be fundamentally different, with new security architecture, realigned alliances, and accelerated diversification. This is the governance action slide, and I want to be direct. This is the most important slide in the briefing for every board member. We have updated the 30-day column to reflect the ceasefire for Hormuz dynamic. In addition to the established actions, we have replaced the previous item about assessing the 15-point plan with a more specific directive. Model the ceasefire for Hormuz scenario implications for your sector, because if Hormuz reopens as part of a ceasefire deal, the energy market impact will be immediate and dramatic. Boards that have modeled this scenario will be days ahead of those that haven't. In the next 30 days, activate geopolitical risk as a standing board item. Convene emergency risk committee sessions. Map supply chain exposure to all 3 choke points. Review sanctions compliance, stress test at $130 oil, and model the Hormuz reopening scenario. In 60 days, establish dedicated geopolitical risk oversight. Implement scenario-based planning. Begin dual sourcing supply chains. Review insurance coverage. Update crisis communications. In 90 to 180 days, restructure governance for sustained uncertainty, build geopolitical literacy programs, develop adaptive strategy frameworks, consider regional rebalancing. The key message this week is that the April 6th deadline creates urgency. If you haven't started the 30-day actions yet, you are already behind. This is your monitoring dashboard. Let me walk you through the week-over-week changes carefully. Starting with oil prices. Brent crude remains in the $99 to $102 range, but with significant daily volatility, swinging between 98 and 106 in a single session. This stays in the red zone, right at the amber boundary, similar to last week. Hormuz transits. This is the most significant deterioration. Last week we reported approximately 16 transits. This week, the strait is under effective blockade with near 0 commercial transits. This has moved deeper into red. Sanctions remain at 1,300 plus new designations. Red Sea shipping remains paused with Houthi re-engagement risk rising. Nuclear breakout assessment remains complicated by IAEA's inability to access facilities. GCC FDI continues declining 60 to 70%. The defense sector shows an interesting shift. The ITA ETF is up 47% year over year, but has pulled back from its peak as analysts cite 34 times earnings valuation concerns. This remains in the red zone, but the direction of movement has changed. Container shipping costs have worsened to 175% above baseline, up from 150% last week. 7 of 8 indicators remain firmly in red zone. The ceasefire for Hormuz framework is the only structural off-ramp visible, but until Hormuz reopens, the underlying supply disruption continues to worsen. Boards should treat this as the most severe risk environment since 1973. Here is our weekly forecast for April 2nd through April 9th, with probability assignments compared to last week. At 85%, down from 90%, no formal ceasefire this week. We have lowered this because the diplomatic track is now more active, and the April 6th deadline creates a forcing function. But the gap between demands remains enormous. At 80%, this is new. The April 6th energy pause deadline will drive either significant escalation or accelerated deal momentum. This is the most consequential binary event of the coming week. At 80%, down from 85%, oil prices remain above $95. The diplomatic track creates more downside risk for oil than we saw last week. At 85%, unchanged, Iranian strikes continue declining in volume, consistent with munition depletion analysis. At 85%, up from 80%, Israel continues expanding Litani operations and destroys additional bridges. The Kazmir bridge destruction signals clear escalation. At 80%, slightly down from 85%, Iraqi militia attacks continue at elevated tempo. The slight decrease reflects possible Iranian signaling to proxies as diplomatic channels open. At 60%, down from 65%, Houthis maintain their pause. This is our most fragile forecast. Bloomberg's $140 oil warning highlights the consequences if this breaks. At 75%, unchanged, Trump makes further nearing completion or ceasefire statements. At 60%, up from 55%, the IAEA raises further concerns about unaccounted enriched uranium. And at 65%, up from 60%, European leaders intensify their UN-mediated ceasefire push. Our overall confidence remains moderate high, but the April 6th deadline creates a binary risk that widens our uncertainty band significantly. Let me close with the most important message of this entire briefing. A ceasefire for Hormuz framework is emerging. This is the first genuine structural off-ramp since the conflict began on February 28th. But the structural conditions that produced this war will persist well beyond any deal. The April 6th energy pause deadline is the next critical inflection point. If Trump resumes strikes on Iranian oil facilities, the diplomatic track could collapse within hours. If the pause extends further, the framework strengthens. 4 imperatives for every board member. First, treat geopolitical risk with the same rigor as financial and cyber risk. This is no longer optional. Second, monitor the April 6th deadline closely. A ceasefire for Hormuz deal could reshape global energy markets overnight. Have your scenario models ready. Third, build resilience, not prediction. This week's 48-hour swings from ceasefire claims to denials prove that adaptive governance beats predictive governance every time. And fourth, act now. The boards that respond within 30 days will lead. Those that wait 180 days will follow. If you haven't started the 30-day governance actions from this briefing, today is the day. This has been the Global Board Institute's Super Forecaster Geopolitical Crisis Briefing for the week of April 2nd, 2026. We will be back next Thursday with updated forecasts, scenario probabilities, and governance recommendations. Thank you for your attention. Stay vigilant, stay prepared.